Hello, and thank you very, very much for joining us today at the latest webinar for me to talk a little bit about how ADHD has shaped my life, both the positives and some of the struggles, how it played a part in my founding of Lad Bible and Unilad, what led me to seek a diagnosis of ADHD, and I think most importantly, what has starting a podcast on the subject and speaking to some of the world's leading ADHD experts taught me about those four letters. But my journey as a neurodivergent person starts like many of us, and that's at a really early age. And that's with a feeling of being a bit different and misunderstood. My earliest memory of feeling different was when I was in the playground at school at 7 years old. Someone said to me, "Alex, you could be one of the cool kids if you weren't so weird." Hundreds of little comments like that that really compounded over my school years to create an adult that felt intrinsically different and misunderstood. I've always had this internalized racing mind, this internalized hyperactivity. I describe it as having 10 highly caffeinated squirrels barreling around in my head. And in some situations, like my bedroom at that age, those squirrels, that internalized hyperactivity enabled me to be very creative. At that same age, I was starting businesses. At that age, I started my first board game. I went through my parents' board games, found all of the addresses of the companies that manufactured them, and spent the evenings designing a board game, writing the instructions, making the pieces, and I sent it to all of these companies. And I didn't hear anything. But after 2 weeks, I had one reply, and they said, "Alex," and I think they could tell I was really young because my handwriting was really messy. They said, "Unfortunately, we're not looking for any new designs at the moment, but always lean into this entrepreneurial spirit." And I really listened to that. In another environment, like the classroom, those squirrels created a lot of anxiety, that racing mind. At the same age, at 7 years old, I was very happily sat at the back of the classroom, daydreaming, minding my own business, and the teacher pointed at me and said, "Alex, do you know the answer to this question?" And all of the classmates turned to look at me, and in that moment I felt my heart rate accelerating. And I remember abruptly standing up, running out of the classroom and finding someone in the corridor and saying, "Please call an ambulance, I'm having a heart attack." And of course, when the paramedic arrived and reassured me, I wasn't having a heart attack, I was having my first anxiety attack at 7 years old. This juxtaposition between how I was presenting in one environment, my bedroom, compared to how I was presenting at school, very anxious, very shut down, fascinated me at the time. The next 15 years really was a continuation of this juxtaposition. It was the same brain, just two different environments, and yet the trajectory of the outcomes was so different. When the time came to go to university, I had this trail of businesses that I had started and then abandoned behind me. So I'd lost a lot of confidence in my ability to be an entrepreneur. So I applied to university. I went to Oxford Brookes. And I remember my first day, I went to one lecture. And the lecturer didn't even need to point at me. I just remember feeling that anxiety coming back. And I stood up from the lecture theatre and walked off this anxiety attack around the streets of Oxford. But I went back to my university bedroom where I had this idea to create a late night pizza delivery company. And I impulsively spent half of my student loan on this 6-foot giant freezer, huge freezer, and I filled it with Tesco frozen pizzas. And I set up a Facebook page called Quick Pizza. And if a student wanted a pizza in the middle of the night, I would put a pizza in the oven. And I had 5 students cycling around Oxford in the middle of the night delivering pizzas for me. But then the university shut me down because I didn't have a food safety hygiene certificate. So at that stage, I had the entrepreneurialness in me, but I was lacking the attention to detail. In my second year of university, that's when social media was really dominating. Everyone was on Facebook. And I remember becoming absolutely fascinated by it. I didn't have the word for it at the time, but now I would use the word hyperfocus to describe the obsession that I had. That's the year I started Unilad and Lad Bible. And I remember just absolutely obsessing over both of them. They both grew very fast. And I had an email from one of the UK's largest pizza companies offering me X amount of money to be promoted on the page. And I thought to myself, if I somehow conquer this anxiety, if I manage to go to university, get my degree, the amount of money that this pizza company is offering me for one post is more than I will get in my graduate salary. So I left university the following month, went back home and went all in on these two brands. I had Unilad on one screen, Lad Bible on another screen, both with millions of followers, both with an email inbox from brands wanting to work with me. There was so much to do. And that was when I started to struggle. I didn't have the words for it at the time, but I would now look back and say I was overwhelmed. I needed help. I put out an advert asking for help, and I met these two men in Brighton. We were all going to go into business together. And I remember the day I met them, my intuition was screaming at me. These two people are not on your side. Do not trust these two men. But because I was such a people pleaser and so scared of confrontation, didn't know how to say no, had no understanding of how to put any boundaries around myself, I signed the bit of paper that was put in front of me. And very shortly afterwards, I woke up and I had been completely kicked out of the business, completely removed from the Facebook page. I went to see a solicitor and they looked at what I had signed and they said, these two guys aren't allowed to have done what they've done. But if you want to fight this, this is going to be won or lost in a courtroom, and you're going to have to give evidence on the witness box. And as the solicitor was telling me this, I remember my mind flashed forward to the imagery of me on that witness box with the judge, my legal team, their legal team. And my mind flashed back to the 7-year-old Alex in the classroom with all of that attention on him. And I remember my heart rate going again. And I stood up from my solicitor's office, ran out and went to buy a bottle of vodka. And I can only tell you what the nurse told me when I woke up in hospital the next morning. She said 2 members of the public had found me in an alleyway, clutching the bottle, still clutching the bottle of vodka. I tried to stagger away, I tripped, and hit my head on the wall, and they called an ambulance. And as the nurse was telling me this, I remember feeling this immense amount of anxiety, shame, and embarrassment. And in that naive state, I knew the only thing that would cure this anxiety was more alcohol. And I remember standing up from the hospital bed, running out of the ward, trying to escape the hospital because I knew there was a petrol station over the road. Security had been called. And before I knew it, I was on the floor being restrained by the hospital security. My parents had been called, and I remember looking out, seeing my mum making eye contact with me with this look of fear and desperation in her eyes. She didn't know what was wrong with me. I didn't know what was wrong with me. I didn't know what I was contending with in my head. That took me to Alcoholics Anonymous, where I first heard those 4 letters, ADHD, but I didn't think much of it at that stage. Fast forward 2 months, the trial happened. I was cross-examined on the witness box for 7 days. Even the judge said it was excessive. But he was very accommodating. He let me take regular breaks. He let me walk off the anxiety around the streets, around the courthouse. And I got through the trial. Fast forward another month, and my telephone went. It was my solicitor. And he said, Alex, are you on your own? And I said, yes. And he said, you've won everything. You've won the company's back. And I remember falling to my knees and bursting into tears because, yes, it was a 5-year legal battle, but it was also a 5-year mental health battle for me that nearly cost me my life. And as I reflected on the experience, it became so obvious that there were some massive contradictions in my life. some serious, some quite comical. On the one hand, I was clearly entrepreneurial, but on the other hand, I was so scared of saying no, and that put me into some really vulnerable situations. I crave stimulation, but I'm also overly stimulated. I love oversharing when I'm at social gatherings, but then I also get huge amounts of anxiety replaying what I overshared. I work best in a clean environment, but I also struggle to keep my environment clean. I don't like change, but I also will change my entire personality based off the main character of the latest film that I've watched. I'm terrible at picking up social cues, but I will also pick up on the tiniest change in your tone of voice and assume that you hate me. As I researched all of these contradictions, more and more those 4 letters kept coming up. ADHD. And as I dived into the research, I thought, I need to get assessed. I got assessed. I had a questionnaire filled out by my mum and by my long-term partner. I had a 2-hour meeting with a psychologist. And at the end of the session, she said, Alex, I can tell you now your ADHD is clear as hell. I went into problem-solving mode. I wanted to understand what it was that I had just been diagnosed with. So I Googled, what is ADHD? And Google told me what a doctor would tell you if you were listening to a doctor today. And that is that ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by traits of impulsivity, forgetfulness, and disorganization. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the challenges. But I think once understood and managed, ADHD is so much more than that. ADHD is also creativity and pattern recognition, being great in a crisis, being able to zoom out and see details that many people miss, being a great problem solver, being an out-of-the-box thinker, being resilient, being loyal, being fiercely intuitive. All of these things make someone a tremendous asset to society and also to the workplace. I started speaking to people in the community. I went to events. I started my podcast, ADHD Chatter. And tragically, the more I spoke to people, the more it was glaringly obvious that when you have ADHD, but you're gliding through life without the knowledge that you have ADHD, for those people, ADHD is also years and years and years of being called too sensitive, or too much, or not enough. ADHD can be a confusion, not understanding why so many people seem to just be gliding forward in life with apparent ease, and yet certain things for you are so challenging. It's not understanding why you have to put on a mask and change your entire personality to be more likable or palatable for whoever you're stood in front of on any given day. ADHD is not understanding why the tiniest criticism or rejection can be so physically painful for you. All of these things can be really, really detrimental to someone's mental health. And as I spoke to these amazing people on my podcast, it became so clear that in order to access the many benefits that come from thinking differently, you have to really understand the 3 key challenges that come with ADHD. And the first challenge that needs to be understood is the executive functioning challenges and the overwhelm that this can create. And I think the best way to describe ADHD overwhelm to someone who doesn't understand it is using this pen. This pen represents a neurotypical person's brain. This pen has one tip, and the tip represents a thought. And because there's only one thought, it's quite easy for that thought to come through and turn into an action. This pen, that I'm sure we'll all be familiar with, the multicolored, multi-tipped pen, this represents an ADHD brain. This brain has many thoughts. This thought is, I need to text my friend back. This thought is, I need to reply to that email. This thought is, I need to renew my car insurance. And this thought is, I really should drink water. And in the ADHD brain, all of the thoughts, they're happening at the same time. They're all trying to push through simultaneously. And because of that, it creates a chaos inside that blocks any of them from being able to turn into an action. And for me, that's a great analogy that explains ADHD overwhelm. And of course, if someone is experiencing really bad ADHD overwhelm, on some days it can get really bad, and that can render the person physically paralyzed and unable to get off the sofa and stop scrolling social media, because in that moment, scrolling social media is the only thing that's distracting them from that horrible inner critic that is telling them that they're useless. And if you are with someone who's experiencing this and you don't understand ADHD overwhelm, then that exposes that person to comments like, why are you so lazy? Why can't you just do the thing? Why can't you just start? And of course, that compounds and perpetuates that inner critic even further. But my solution to ADHD overwhelm is to get the thoughts out of your head and write them down. I used to hold a huge amount of shame for some of the tools I used to manage the more challenging aspects of ADHD. But I don't hold any shame towards them anymore because they work. And if they work for you, then there's absolutely no reason to feel shameful about them. And what works for me is I have a big whiteboard in every room of my flat. So when an idea comes into my mind, there's an easily accessible option for me to immediately write it down. Because if I don't write it down, I'll move on, I'll go into the other room to do something else, and that thought will cease to exist and it won't happen. I also take advantage of my brain when it's at its most optimal. And for me, that's in the evening. For me, my nighttime brain is more efficient, it's more optimal, it's more focused. My morning brain is the opposite, it's very sluggish. So I take advantage of my nighttime brain to really help out morning brain. And in the night, I think, what are 5 high priority tasks that need to be done tomorrow? 5 things that are going to be important to push me forward in my mission. And I write those 5 high priority tasks down on 5 bracelets, 5 of those cheap rubber bracelets you can buy. And when I wake up in the morning, I put the bracelets on because A, they act as a visual reminder of what they are. And B, as I go through my day and I complete the tasks, I can take off the corresponding bracelet and put them in a bowl. And if I complete the tasks, if I fill up the bowl, then I reward myself. I buy myself something off my Amazon wish list, for example. I gamify it, essentially. And the third thing that I do to combat ADHD overwhelm is I try and really create accountability that is outside of myself. Often if I rely on my own accountability, something else will get my attention and the thing won't get done. So I bring in an accountability buddy. And for me, that's my partner or my brother or my sister. But for you, it will be very individualized. Someone who you can share your goals, your ambitions, your daily tasks with. And then you can have check-ins either at the end of the day or the end of the week or even hourly if it's more casual, to really keep you on track and to enable you to get over that procrastination hump that many people with ADHD find challenging. The second challenge that needs to be understood with ADHD is something called RSD. And it stands for rejection sensitive dysphoria. And for me and many others, it really is the Achilles heel of ADHD if not understood. And essentially it's a visceral, physiological, instant, painful response to criticism, real or perceived. Someone could reply to a text message with a thumbs up emoji and it feels like they hate you. Or you could be showing someone your favorite film and they get up to use the bathroom and you say, shall I pause it? And they say, no, don't worry. Or You meet someone at a party and you impulsively overshare, and then you're lying in bed overthinking that encounter, thinking that they definitely think you're too much and now hate you. It's really horrible. I wanted to know where it came from. I spoke to a brilliant doctor on my podcast called Dr. Samantha Hugh, PhD, and she explained to me that children with ADHD are exposed to 20,000 more negative criticisms in their early years. 20,000 more micro corrections and comments. For example, why are you so naughty? Why can't you just be normal? Stop fidgeting. You're lazy. All of these comments can compound over a childhood to create a brain that under scanning looks remarkably similar to one who has experienced complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's no surprise, therefore, to go through a childhood being exposed to all of those comments and therefore to turn into an adult that is so primed to react defensively in the face of a criticism. I manage ADHD and RSD particularly with a reminder to myself that those 20,000 comments I experienced as a child were not my fault, because I was not broken, I was just different. And therefore, my response to those 20,000 comments is also not my fault. Reminding yourself in the moment of how brilliant you are as well is really soothing, and having a trusted person who you can lean on in moments when you are triggered. And if you know you're going into a situation where the chances of you experiencing a criticism or a rejection, like a work evaluation meeting, for example, is heightened, then you can really strengthen your scaffolding around yourself at that stage and call your accountability buddy and say, I need you today. Can you remind me of my strengths? Because when I come out of this meeting, I'm going to be particularly vulnerable. Dr. Samantha Hugh also taught me some practical tools in the moment to snap yourself out of the intense feelings of sadness or rage after we encounter a criticism. You can bite down on ice, an ice cube, physically bite down on it, or run your hand under cold water. Little practical tools to distract your nervous system when you are triggered. And if possible, to remove yourself from the situation once you are triggered. It's so easy to couple this triggering with ADHD impulsivity, and when you are feeling that intense sadness, to say something in retaliation that is disproportionate to the comment that triggered you. And it's disproportionate often because you're not responding to what that person has said in the here and the now. Your nervous system is responding to the 20,000 comments from your childhood. And the comment that was said in the here and the now has simply reminded your nervous system of those. So if we do respond in the here and the now, it can be blown out of all proportion and be a source of great deal of shame and anxiety if we act in the moment. So remove yourself from the situation if you can. Give yourself time to regulate, ground yourself, and then you can reapproach the situation with a clearer mind. The third aspect of ADHD that I find particularly challenging that needs to be managed is masking. I think ADHD people are the world's best actors. We are phenomenal at playing a character called normal. We are chameleons. We are shapeshifters. We will adopt someone's entire tone of voice. We will mirror their facial expressions. All because we want to be liked. And in the moment, this can feel really soothing. It shields us from any rejection. It shields us from any criticism. But the long-term consequences of that is you become someone who doesn't really understand who they really are. And when you don't have a clear understanding of who you really are, it's very difficult to know which opportunities are a good fit for you. For example, a new relationship or a new job or a new hobby. When these things come into our now, it's very easy to act on short-term dopamine and say yes to that new relationship or yes to that new job, or yes to that new hobby and impulsively buy the domain. But if it's not a true fit for who you really are underneath, after the honeymoon period has passed, that's when that job will get boring. That's when you'll leave that relationship. That's when the domain you bought for that hobby will be another domain in the graveyard of domains that so many people with ADHD have. I think growing your self-awareness is the cornerstone of ADHD management. I don't think ADHD is a deficit of attention. I think when someone with ADHD finds that thing that sets their soul on fire, that thing that they're truly interested in, we have an abundance of attention. We can hyperfocus on that thing. We can become the best in the world at that thing. I truly believe ADHD is more a deficit of self-awareness because of years of masking and pretending to be someone else, which is totally exhausting. How have I grown my self-awareness since starting my podcast? I ask myself some really basic questions as often as I can. What happened today that made me happy? What happened today that made me sad? What happened today that I enjoyed? What happened today that I found challenging? And you have to be honest with these basic questions. You have to be honest because it's so easy to, when you're asking yourself these, and it could be sat on your bed at the end of the day, it could be in the shower, it could be driving home from work. You have to be honest because the mask can be so subconsciously entrenched sometimes that even the answers to these questions could be part of the mask. We have to pay attention to our knee-jerk reactions as well when building self-awareness. Our subconscious reactions that occur before our subconscious masked version has a chance to respond. For example, if you're reading a newspaper and you see an advert for a musical theatre role, they're auditioning for a part and your soul gets so excited for that opportunity. But then you remember that your parents wanted you to be a doctor or something else. And you suppress the excitement to that musical theatre role. That's what I mean about a knee-jerk reaction. They'll all be individual to you, but pay attention to yours because that will be your inner child shouting out, trying to remind you of who you really are and what you're really passionate about. How does all of this show up in the workplace? My interest in ADHD in the workplace really started in 2016 when I had a job. I had to pay for my legal fees and I got a job in a marketing agency. I was brought in to grow their Facebook. It was a busy office, loud music, a table tennis table, music playing. My mind in that environment was completely overstimulated, completely overwhelmed. And I grew their Facebook in that 3 months from 0 to 5,000 followers. And I had to leave. I was so anxious. I got a job in another marketing agency afterwards, and I said to my new boss, can I work from home sometimes? Can I work downstairs in the cafeteria sometimes where it's quiet? And most importantly, can you trust me and judge me on my outcomes and not my processes? And they said yes. And in the same 3-month period, I had grown this agency's Facebook following to 8 million people from 0. And for me, it was such a clear example of how very basic adjustments and changes can make such a drastic difference to the trajectory of someone's results. And I think companies, when supporting neurodiversity, it really has to start at the very beginning, at the phase of job advert, and being really inclusive with language. And what do I mean by that? I mean, someone with ASD, for example, autism, they could be a literal thinker. And they might see an advert that says, we need a clear communicator. And a literal thinker will look at that and think, well, I'm clear at communicating in emails, but in group settings, I struggle. Anxiety takes over. And that uncertainty about what is required from that position will create an anxiety that will stop them from applying for that role. And in job interviews, give the interview questions ahead of time. Throw out outdated metrics of what it means to be professional. If someone doesn't have a firm handshake or makes perfect eye contact, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not paying attention. It might mean that they are required to not make perfect eye contact in order to pay attention. I say you can either have my perfect eye contact or you can have my undivided attention, but you can't have both. It took me 34 years to realize that for me and many other people in the workplace, something as simple as eye contact is masking. And in meetings, give the agenda ahead of time. Take away some of the uncertainty, the anxiety that comes with stepping into the unknown. And after meetings, give minutes of what was discussed to everyone in attendance. In meetings, it's so important to give the problem to the group and not always let the extrovert, the loud person dictate the solution. Sometimes the quiet person, the person tapping their foot under the table, might have brilliance in their brain, but they're too anxious in that setting to contribute. If it's not urgent, give a grace period where the group can go away with the information. An hour, 24 hours if it's not urgent. And they can submit ideas, submit solutions in a safe way. My experience as a leader for the last 20 years is that in business and in meetings, often the best ideas are trapped inside anxious minds. And if you allow a grace period for people to go away with the information, that's how you can unlock those amazing ideas. Giving people a map of the building and the surrounding area, really basic accommodation that can take away a lot of the uncertainty that comes with anxiety of not knowing your exact geographical location. Normalizing the use of fidget toys and noise-cancelling headphones, really basic. I always have to have something in my hand to channel the hyperactivity that I have, because if it doesn't get channeled into something, it will end up in my mind and turn into anxiety, which will stop me from doing the job that I'm capable of doing. I think it's so important to encourage meetings, movement in meetings, walking meetings, to not make it compulsory to have webcams on during virtual discussions. But most importantly, it's about recognizing that everyone on this webinar today and everyone in every company in the world, every single person's brain is as unique as their fingerprint. And therefore, the little adjustments that will enable somebody will also be unique to them. And it's about creating a psychological safety in the environment that enables somebody to feel comfortable to ask for help. And I think putting an adjustments policy on your website is brilliant. Putting a box on the wall with fidget toys in it is brilliant. Bringing in neurodivergent speakers, putting out signals that this is a safe environment run by people with true empathy is really powerful when leaders are honest and open about their struggles and their diagnoses and how they manage some of the challenges that come from being a leader with ADHD. All of these trickle down and create an environment that enable the person who might otherwise be sat in silent, too anxious to ask for help, to feel comfortable that they are in an environment where if they do ask for help, it will be met with true empathy. I think many of the reasons people don't ask for help at work is quite alarming. When I got my ADHD diagnosis, I posted on LinkedIn and I said, I have ADHD, I've just been diagnosed. And I had tens and tens of comments and DMs saying, you must be brave, Alex. You must be brave to talk about ADHD. And I thought the presumption of bravery is proof that stigma still exists. And it's stigma in the workplace that is the reason many people don't ask for help. It's the reason many people suffer in silence. And I think a great cause of the stigma is often down to some myths surrounding ADHD. And there's 3 myths that I'd like to debunk today. The first one is that only boys can have ADHD. That's actually what the medical community believed 40 years ago. Only boys could have ADHD. Well, now we know that's very much not the case. Women and men have ADHD just in equal amounts. It can present slightly differently in women, but a whole generation of women were misdiagnosed with an anxiety disorder, told that they were crazy, cast away by their doctors. Women and girls, boys and girls can have ADHD just as much as each other. The second myth surrounding ADHD is that it's only physical hyperactivity. Again, many people might not relate to the physical hyperactivity. They have those internalized squirrels, and they don't want to ask for help because they fear that who they're asking for help only thinks that ADHD is physically hyperactive. For the reasons I've gone into, ADHD can be very internalized, more inattentive. And the third myth surrounding ADHD is that the media really don't help this narrative, and that's that everyone has ADHD these days. We know from the World Health Organization that 20% of people are neurodivergent. And by that, I mean would fall under the umbrella of neurodiversity, and that's ADHD and autism and dyspraxia and OCD and dyslexia and dyscalculia. Only 6% of people would reach the criteria for an ADHD diagnosis. The confusion comes from the fact that the traits of ADHD are very human. Everyone has traits of ADHD. Everyone will forget their car keys from time to time. Everyone will zone out of conversation from time to time. But when a neurotypical person experiences these highs and lows, it's like a small wave. But when someone who would reach the criteria for an ADHD diagnosis experiences the highs and lows, the highs are the summit of Everest and the lows are the lowest point on Earth. It's the continuousness of those swings and the never-endingness of those swings that can cause, when not understood, some serious comorbidities and mental health challenges. As a leader with ADHD, I've adopted various strategies to help me manage my ADHD, subconsciously and some consciously. But I think to end the webinar, before we go into some questions, I'd like to share the 6 habits that I've adopted that have really enabled me to thrive with ADHD. And the first one is that I really am aware of how much of a people pleaser ADHD made me. It was a protective mechanism to shield me from the pain of RSD. And that day when I signed that bit of paper, it cost me greatly. Where now, when I'm presented with an opportunity, my knee-jerk reaction is still to say yes, because it's still innately in me. But now I have an awareness, I reframe the yes to a, can I let you know tomorrow? Or can I let you know in an hour? Whatever time period it might be, but it enables me to just put a breaker between the ask and my response. It gets me out of the state of high arousal that the people pleaser part of me normally wins. And actually 9 times out of 10, after 24 hours, it's a no. It ring fences my energy, which is so finite with people with ADHD. And if you don't adopt this very simple strategy of just saying, can I let you know tomorrow, instead of yes, then we take on too much. We say yes to everything, we overcommit, and this cycle of overcommitting and then burnout perpetuates. The second strategy that I adopt is, I call it the invisible metaphorical ideas shelf. I, like so many people with ADHD, have so many ideas, and it's easy to say yes to them all impulsively, action each one, buy the domain for that new side hustle, design the logo for that new hobby. But instead of actioning it immediately, I place the idea on a metaphorical ideas shelf. I just put it to one side. And if it's still pulling on my interest strings, that idea, in 2 weeks, then that for me is a good indicator that that idea is a good fit for my core interests. And after 2 weeks, if it's still pulling on my interest strings, then I take action towards it. The third strategy that I've adopted is really to combat the effects of imposter syndrome. Many people with ADHD, myself included, we move at 1,000,000 miles an hour. We very much live in the now. And if things aren't in our now, we can forget they exist. And this is true for achievements. I call it success amnesia. We can literally forget that we're capable of doing stuff. So when the opportunity comes to do that things again, we don't feel qualified. We feel like an imposter. I'm so intentional now about celebrating the wins as they happen, really taking time to journal the memories that are associated with that win. For example, if I'm speaking on stage and I'm having a conversation with someone and they say that they really enjoyed it, then I will, on the train home, write that down and really meditate on it, to try and store the evidence in my subconscious that I am capable of speaking on stage again. Because before I did this simple task, I had tremendous anxiety before doing a task that I had done many times before again. Taking that time to intentionally celebrate the wins, whatever they are in your life, in your business, to really cement the evidence in your subconscious that you are capable, you are qualified to be in the room. You are the right person to do the task because you have done it amazingly well in the past. And the fourth strategy I've adopted is to really recognize my early signs of burnout. They will look different to everyone, but now I'm really aware to keep an eye on mine. Mine are if I order more takeaway food, if my exercise routine takes a hit, if I'm noticing myself getting more grumpy with those around me. That to me is a signal that my body is telling me to take time out, to take a pause. Before I was paid attention to my early signs of burnout, I would just push through the stress, push through the anxiety, and for me that resulted in drinking alcohol, and that led me to some really dangerous places. Really being aware of your early signs of burnout will really help you protect your energy and listen to your body signals to say when it's time to take a break. And the fifth tool that I use is really to look at big tasks that come my way and break them down into smaller tasks. Essentially, if I get a chisel and I look at a task as an iceberg, to really break it down into ice cubes, to make it less overwhelming, less overstimulating, more chance of me completing it. For example, the podcast is in itself a business, but I've really broken it down into episodes. Each episode is a new person to obsess over, hyperfocus over, meet, interview, edit, put the episode out, and that itself is an ice cube that goes out, and they build up to create the business. And it's also being honest and recognizing that some days are going to be harder than others. And in some days, to have no shame about breaking those ice cubes down into really small tasks. On some days, sending an email could be an ice cube. But on another day, when I'm feeling particularly drained, I need to take the chisel and chisel that ice cube down into smaller parts. Picking up my laptop, one ice cube, plugging it in, another, opening the lid, opening and turning it on, another. So it's having no shame and really recognizing that on some days when various things are making life particularly challenging on that day, that you need to make those ice cubes even smaller. And ultimately, the final technique I've adopted is to remind myself that I don't need to be fixed. I think too many people with ADHD try and fix themselves. They try and push themselves into a hole that is a different shape to what they are. They try and make them neurotypical. And firstly, that's exhausting. It takes up so much time. And you don't need to be fixed because you're not broken. And when you stop doing this, you reclaim that time. And when you reclaim that time, you suddenly have so much more resources to work on your self-awareness, to find community, to find the thing that really aligns with who you really are. In fact, the only thing people with ADHD need to fix about themselves is really the way they talk to themselves, the inner critic inside their head. I've said things to myself that I wouldn't say to my worst enemy. That's the only thing people with ADHD need to fix. I wish I could go back and put my arms around the 7-year-old Alex in the corridor having that panic attack and tell him that and reassure him that the thing that you're feeling anxious about now, the thing that you're feeling anxious about now, the feeling of difference, the traits that you're feeling different for are the things that will make you amazing when you're an adult and will turn out to be your biggest strengths. Thank you so much for listening. And I would really like to open the floor to some questions. Thank you very much.
So starting with some questions. What was your childhood like? Would you say your symptoms were stereotypical of ADHD in childhood?
So I've always associated with having inattentive ADHD. it was very much environmental. When I was at school, I was very anxious and very still. But that anxiety ended up in that hyperactivity ended up in my mind. When I was at home, I was being very creative, very entrepreneurial. I started a car washing business when I was 8. I had a stall outside my parents' house when I was 9, selling antiques. My dad's an antiques dealer, and bits that he couldn't sell. So I was very confident and entrepreneurial at home, but very shut down. I think had I had known about the difference earlier, there would have been a significant reduction in shame. I think what schools can do now is to really create a better dialogue between the teacher and the home environment. Had there been that sort of my parents profiling my behavior, and then you can compare that to teachers profiling my behavior, that difference would have been spotted at a much younger age, and an intervention could have been made. But my childhood really was a complete contradiction. On the one hand, presenting in one environment very positively and then very negatively in another.
What was the assessment process like, and how long did it take?
The assessment process took about 6 months. I went private. I had to fill out, my mum had to fill out a questionnaire. My mum, the psychologist looked at the questionnaire that my mum filled out and said that it's not uncommon. You see parents that they're not hiding from the truth, but they feel quite defensive, and it's quite common for parents to say Alex was the perfect child. Apparently my mum had written that there were no issues whatsoever, and when in reality, on some days my parents couldn't get me in the car. I was so terrified to go to school, and it took some digging with my mum to really get honest answers on the questionnaire, because I think there's a lot of feeling like they missed it, and guilt that comes with that, and therefore quite deflective answers. But that was a conversation me and my mum have had since. My partner, long-term partner, she filled out the other questionnaire. She knows me tremendously well, and she was really honest. We spoke about RSD a lot in the questionnaire, how very tiny comments in the relationship I took really badly, and I took as an insult or a rejection, and how I withdrew and disappeared. And then I had the meeting with the psychologist, and she looked at all of these, and she recognized this boom and bust cycle that is so common with ADHD, this sort of starting something, going all in, buying the domain, getting really excited, and then losing interest, because when we're acting on short-term dopamine, we're saying yes to lots of things, and because we don't really understand who we really are, when that opportunity gets tough, which they all do eventually, every business gets tough, every relationship gets tough, every job gets tough, we abandon a lot, because you have to really be invested in that thing to keep going when it gets tough. And it's that cycle of boom and bust that the psychologist recognized in my behavior that led to the diagnosis.
If you think someone has ADHD, how can you broach it with them sensitively?
It's a very sensitive subject. And this applies in the workplace as well. You don't need to mention the 4 letters. You can say, I would always put the spotlight on your behavior, and frame it in the direction of the person that you're trying to help. So if I suspect someone has ADHD, rather than me going, I think you're ADHD because you're occasionally late or you're forgetful, I would say that I am the type of person who struggles with timekeeping. This is the tools that I use. I have an accountability buddy to help me with timekeeping. I gamify my timekeeping. So if I am late, then I reward myself if I'm on time. So, and then when you open up that conversation, you then essentially you're opening up the gates for that person to respond with, oh, I experienced that too. And it opens up a conversation. I think sort of essentially finger pointing and saying, I think you have ADHD because X, Y, and Z could be met with a very defensive response, and do the opposite of what you want. So the same applies in the workplace. I think it's particularly important when leaders are trying to help or suggest that someone might need accommodations, to always start the conversation with, I'm the sort of person who really struggles with overwhelming tasks, and it helps me when I break them down. If you say that to the employee, then that is opening up the conversation and making them feel safe to then reply with, oh, it's funny you said that. I'm actually similar. I have similar struggles. And then you open up that dialogue in a much more constructive way.
How do you manage the RSD being a public figure promoting ADHD when you get the negative comments from people?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, it's typical, isn't it? You get hundreds of comments and you really focus on the one negative. For me, it's really, I'm quite good at being, when it comes to my social media work, I'm quite good at being objective and seeing that if there's, say, 10 comments and one is neutral and 9 are positive, then objectively that neutral comment is more digestible because the evidence is overwhelmingly positive. For me, it's if there's an insecurity that I have personally and someone has commented something that is directed with that, then that is really painful. For example, I honestly think that I'm a terrible podcast host. I don't think I'm particularly conversational. I'm very wooden. I'm quite dry. But 99% of the comments contradict that. They say, brilliant, you're an amazing podcast host. But in that example, when there is a comment which does happen saying, oh, Alex doesn't really often answer back to what they said, he just moves on to the next question, that has opened up the insecurity that I have about myself, and that completely derails me for hours sometimes, even though in that case the objective evidence is still there. 99% of the comments are saying that I'm good, but if that 1% is confirming an insecurity that I have, then that is particularly painful. And the same really applies to all comments on my social media.
How did your life change once you had the diagnosis?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it didn't sort of instantly change. It wasn't like I was blind and now I see. If I kind of went on a 2-year journey pre-assessment, that I had kind of done a lot of research into ADHD and recognized, I sort of self-identified as ADHD. So it wasn't a sudden, like, I didn't know and now I suddenly know moment. But when the psychologist confirmed it, it's very validating to have your suspicions confirmed by a psychologist. And if someone asks me, is there any point in getting a diagnosis if it's expensive or you've got to wait a long time, unless you are wanting medication, which is great, and I do recommend. I don't personally take medication, but thousands of people I've spoken to, and 99% of people have an overarchingly positive experience. It's hugely validating to have a professional confirm your belief, because I often am quite self-critical. I doubt myself. The imposter syndrome creeps in. So I say, well, I believe I have ADHD, but what if I'm wrong? I must be wrong. And therefore the sort of the foundation of understanding and meaning you're applying to your past to reduce the shame, if that cracks because you are doubting your belief that you have ADHD, then a lot of the work that you've done can be undone. So to have a psychologist confirm that you 100% have ADHD, that's a really powerful bit of evidence to counter the part of your brain that could be doubting your belief that you have ADHD. And you can't manage or you can't work with what you don't know. I didn't know anything about RSD before getting diagnosed, and since then I've an amazing relationship, and we work together to understand it. We really sit down and talk through RSD when it happens. I couldn't do that before because I didn't know about it. I wasn't aware of some of the imposter syndrome element of ADHD, and therefore I probably would have quit the podcast by now had I not, because I didn't stop and pause and really build that evidence of self-belief, because I wasn't aware of this thing called object permanence, which is very common with people with ADHD, this out of sight, out of mind. And as I said, the same applies to achievements. So you have to have an awareness of what you're living with in order to put the scaffolding around you to shield you from some of the more challenging aspects of it?
I'm currently in the process of trying to get my diagnosis of ADHD. What adjustments can a workplace make to support someone?
Yeah, I think normalizing the conversation around ADHD is really important. Bringing in neurodivergent speakers, putting out those signals to show that you really want to learn and want to find out more. I'm a huge advocate for ADHD coaching. And I think that's this can be a really powerful tool to provide help in that interim period between someone thinking maybe I have ADHD and them getting a diagnosis. Having a call with an ADHD coach, someone who is trained and understands the condition and the complexities that come with many of the positives and some of the challenges, can be incredibly soothing for that person who's going on that journey. It boils down to the number one advice around all of this stuff, which is never worry alone. Never feel like you're the only person who's experiencing life this way. And having an ADHD coach, having access to ADHD coaching in the office, and that's like a virtual weekly call or monthly call just to chat about the time period that's passed, the positives and the negatives, and to have someone who understands validate your experience. Talk about that thing happened last Tuesday, well, that was RSD and this is why it happened, can go a long way to reducing a lot of the shame and anxiety in the workplace.
When people are eventually diagnosed with ADHD and you're still reeling from traumatic experience they've had from being misunderstood, how would you advise someone to move forward from these negative experiences after receiving a diagnosis?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And, getting a diagnosis obviously doesn't just unravel years and years and years of trauma. I think it's a lot of work that needs to be done, and almost getting a diagnosis and becoming aware as you sort of going over the start line of this journey of self-understanding. A lot of it is therapy. Therapy is really beneficial to unpack and go back and really understand what has happened in your life that has created who you are today, and that can be paid therapy, which is I highly recommend, or again, never worry alone, speaking to people around you, finding community, finding trusted communities, your partner, your friends, your family. Trauma is a huge conversation, and having traumatic experiences can create many traits of ADHD. And if you have ADHD and you've experienced trauma as well, then you've got additional challenges to face. Again, ADHD coaching can be really beneficial here. Therapy is very important, but don't go through it on your own. Never worry alone. Find community, even if that's at the very basic level of if you're just lying in bed and you're feeling particularly vulnerable and you don't feel like talking to anyone, just finding a comment section on a podcast or on a bit of social media content, it takes away a lot of that pressure. It's very soothing to know that you're not alone and you're not the only one who's experiencing these various challenges.
Abby said, I've recently been diagnosed with ADHD. How do I distinguish what are traits of ADHD and what are just personality traits?
Yeah, so again, it's a brilliant question. It is tricky. I think everyone experiences the traits of ADHD. It's the extremeness of them that would tip you over to sort of reaching a criteria for an ADHD diagnosis. I think with a lot of these things, it's the intensity, the frequency, and the duration of them. It's with rejection sensitivity, for example. Rejection, it's very human to be sensitive to rejection. If we go back, 2.5 million years ago, if we were rejected from our tribe, it would be fatal. We would not have the protection of the group and we would be hunted and killed. So it's a very innate evolutionary response to fear being cast out. That's a very normal, neurotypical standard response to criticism and rejection. The RSD, the rejection sensitive dysphoria, is physically painful. And it's that plus the the 20,000 negative comments that kids with ADHD experience of being different, all of those comments that compound it, which means we sense criticism and rejection even when it's not there. So in that case, in the sense of, in the definition of RSD to normal sensitivity to rejection, it's the intensity and the duration and the frequency of how often it happens are significantly more, and that would be the differentiator. The same with the executive functioning challenges. If you forget your car keys from time to time, that's a very normal response. People are busy, life's busy. If you're forgetting them every day, and it means you're late for work, and then you get fired, which means you then can't pay your mortgage, and if it compounds to have real detrimental and significant negative effects on your life, then the intensity, frequency, and duration of those would be significant to suggest that maybe there is a neurological difference in your brain. We see dopamine and noradrenaline in the prefrontal cortex is responsible for the executive functioning challenges. And in ADHD brain, there are real issues with those two neurotransmitters, and that creates the difference between how often these challenges happen, how long they last for, and how much they affect your life.
Right, it'll be 1 hour, Alex. If you want to give your final thoughts, final advice for anyone on the call, and then sign off.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, just firstly, thank you very much for being here today. And a final reminder that, so many people go through life with ADHD not knowing, and they feel misunderstood, they feel broken. You're not broken. If you are ADHD, you just are different. And you have always been enough. And I'll say it again and again, I truly do believe that great minds do think differently. So thank you very much.